If you're not sure about gardening in a raised bed or in an open ground bed, or maybe you want to try something new, well, this could be your answer. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I discuss everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. Today, let's discuss getting started with container gardening. The idea of container gardening is pretty basic. Instead of building a raised bed and growing there, or tilling up the soil and amending it and then growing in the ground, we choose a container, fill it with soil, and that's where we grow. In today's video, I'm going to highlight 5 factors that will help you become very successful with container gardening. The first consideration when beginning container gardening is just choosing your container. And you have virtually unlimited options. Last year, I did a lot of my gardening in these buckets. This is a container. It's a 4-gallon frosting bucket that I got from the bakery of my local grocery store. It was perfect to grow peppers, herbs, lots of other plants. You don't need to get fancy at all. You can reuse some of the containers that you get when you buy bushes or shrubs or trees, even the small ones. I've got some chives that are just starting to come up again. They've been overwintering in this small pot. That's container gardening. You can get much fancier. I'll be doing a lot of gardening in some decorative pots. If you want something small and simple, you can get an herb pot that has multiple openings. These are easy to find in nurseries. Or you can go even bigger and get one that has a lot of openings. Set this on your porch or patio and you can start growing plants in it. Just be creative in what you already have or maybe how you want to decorate your garden and choose a container of just about any size. 5-gallon buckets are very popular. I know a gardener who grows everything in 5-gallon buckets. Tomatoes, peppers, everything. Becoming more popular are these grow bags. I got these bags from Garsden, and they come in multiple sizes down to 1 gallon. These are 10-gallon bags. These are 15-gallon bags. And the ones that I've already got filled up behind me are 20-gallon bags. So you've got a number of different options. These are very simple. They're made out of cloth. They even have handles on them. You fill them with soil, and you've now got a container to grow your plants in. Consider where you're going to put your containers to help you decide which size of container. And also think about what plants you want to grow in the containers to determine the size. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a couple minutes. Once you have your containers, now it's time to fill them with soil. And you should choose a good potting mix because you're not going to get a lot of the activity with soil microorganisms and earthworms because these containers are closed systems. Whatever soil you put in here, that has to be enough to support your plants. So when you look for a potting mix, consider getting one that already has some slow release fertilizer mixed into it. A name brand of potting mix should be good enough. And depending on the size of your containers, a couple bags may be enough. Now, if you're gardening like I am, where I have a lot of containers, it's more cost effective to make your own potting mix. And that's what I've done. So I've taken 2 parts peat, mixed it with 2 parts mushroom compost, added 1 part vermiculite, and then added a little bit of a balanced fertilizer. For a bin this size, it's about half a cup of a 5-5-5 fertilizer. Using either your own homemade mix or a bagged mix, you fill the pot, the container, and then you wet the soil. Filling those small containers with a potting soil and then moving them around is pretty easy. But when you deal with big pots, or like these 20-gallon grow bags, well, they get pretty darn heavy when you've got some saturated potting soil inside. So I prefer to go ahead and add the bags of potting soil or make it myself once these are in position. And what I did for these bags was just add that same blend. I put in a good portion of the mushroom compost, and then I added about the same amount of peat. And then to this, I poured some vermiculite. I did mix a little bit of perlite in with the vermiculite because it's a little bit easier to see. And then I mixed it all together just by hand until it was all blended. And that's why I like the perlite, because when you can see the little white pieces of perlite evenly distributed throughout the mix, you know that it's been blended pretty well. I start by just filling these bags about a third of the way full, and then I water it very thoroughly. I drench that potting soil, and then I repeat the process for the next third, and then I repeat the process for the next third until the bag is as filled as I want it to be. The same holds true for pots. For the top portion, I'll consider additional fertilizer once I start putting the plants in. It might be worth it for you to go ahead and spend the extra money to really buy quality potting soil, like from Dr. Earth or Fox Farm, because they often have extra amendments like worm castings and some different organic fertilizers that can really benefit your plants. Because the soil is the most important aspect. You can choose any of the containers that are roughly the same size, but if you put different soils in them, you'll get different results. So, to best feed your plants, you need to have a good quality, rich soil. And then anticipate that you will need fertilization through the growing season so that the plants have all of the nutrients that they need. The third factor for your consideration is to plant appropriately. And that means appropriate to the size of the container. While you can grow almost anything in a 5-gallon bucket, I've found that if you grow an indeterminate tomato in one, you're going to have to trellis it. And this bucket may not be stable enough to support a very tall plant. But a 20-gallon grow bag is definitely stable enough, heavy enough, and has enough soil for me to grow something like an indeterminate tomato. But with 18 inches of a good potting soil, this might not be appropriate for growing something like spinach or lettuce, which only requires a few inches of soil. So I could pick a different container that's much more shallow for those type of plants. And while you could grow a few herbs in a pot like this, or maybe 8 or 10 strawberry plants in a container like this, neither are suitable for larger plants like peppers or tomatoes, or especially squash and melons. And while I actually consider this a raised bed, because it is a container with a solid bottom, it's essentially a self-enclosed system. I'm growing horseradish in this. So with this method of container gardening, I'm keeping this plant that could be quite invasive under control. Look for other videos in this container gardening series where I'll spend a lot more time and go more in depth as to the plant selection and making sure that it's appropriate for the container that you choose. To move forward, let's talk about that fourth factor, which is extremely important, and that's watering efficiently. One of the biggest problems with container gardening is that the soil in the containers can dry out very quickly. A little pot like this in full sun might last an hour, maybe 2, before the soil is completely dry. I can probably get a day with one of these 5-gallon buckets before I need to water. The greater volume in these grow bags can give me a little bit longer time, but regardless, because they're exposed to air all the way around, I'm going to have to water more often than other areas of my garden. And the opposite holds true as well. It can be easy to overwater these containers. That's why in these buckets, I always drill drainage holes. I even have holes drilled in the bottom of this large container. You have to give water a place to go, because if you water, or after a deep rain, if you don't have that drainage, the water's going to keep filling up the container and you can drown your plants. So whether you purchase it or make it, ensure that there's adequate drainage for the water that's in the soil. You might be thinking already that this sounds too hard. They dry out too fast. It's easy to overwater. Why would I even want to grow in a container system? Well, it has a lot of advantages. They're mobile. You can choose the perfect spot to grow that gets the greatest amount of sun. And then when the sun changes, you can move the containers around to take advantage of the changing sun. That's one of the greatest advantages. And one of the reasons why I'm so specific about choosing a good soil mix that goes into these containers is because you can help yourself out with that watering problem by having that organic material like peat and compost and some of the other things that those expensive brands use. Well, they will absorb and hold on to a lot of that water, which helps reduce some of the need of continually adding to it and trying to keep it moist. Regardless, the soil, the number of times you water, it all comes down to how moist the soil is for the plants. So try to avoid a regular schedule where you water the same amount at the same time every day, and get in with your hand, with your finger, and check the soil moisture to determine if they need watering at all, or if it's so dry they need extra water. The fifth consideration is to realize that container gardening really isn't much different than any other type of gardening. The plants still need the sun, they still need water, they still need nutrients. They're just growing in a smaller container than a raised bed or open ground. Treat the plants as they need to be treated when they're growing anyplace else, and they'll be just fine. You don't really have to do anything special or different. Just garden the same. If you like square foot gardening, well, you can do the same style of gardening in a container. You might not be able to do the grid lines like you can in a raised bed, but you can practice the same principle of intensive planting within a small space. And you take the seeds or the plants and put them into the container as far apart as you would in square foot gardening, and you can actually grow a lot in a relatively small container. If you practice succession planting, well, then keep doing it in your containers. If you haven't done it, well, then start. And if you don't know what it is, here's the idea. In this bag, I'm going to be growing cucumbers, but at some point late in the season, the vines are going to be played out, maybe some cold has zapped them and they're starting to die. So I pull the cucumbers out, and now I plant beets or turnips or spinach or chard or some other cool season plant that doesn't mind the changing weather of fall and the cold temperatures. I can keep doing that. In the spring, I just do the opposite. I grow some plants. When I've harvested all of them, then I grow different plants. When I've harvested all of them, then I grow different plants. I do the same in all the rest of my bed. So why be different just because it's a container? You can be up and running with a container garden in almost no time at all. In about half an hour, I had all of these bags set up and filled, and that included the time to mix my own soil. If I had used the bagged potting mix, it would have been a fraction of the time. So if you're just getting started and you're not sure about where your garden is going to go or what kind of beds you're going to make, consider starting with a system like grow bags. Now, going into winter, there are some concerns with your containers because this moist soil can freeze, and especially if you're using a terracotta pot or maybe a ceramic pot, they could crack, they could split. So it's often better to store those in a shed or a garage. As to these grow bags, I'm going to take the soil in here and add it to my raised beds when it comes time to amend my soil in the fall. And then I can just fold these up and put them in my shed. They'll be all ready to go next year, and I'll put good, fresh, nutrient-rich soil in these bags for next year's growing. If you have any questions about any of this, please let me know in the comments below. And do look for those future videos that will continue this series with much more in-depth information. To make sure you see those videos, by all means subscribe to the Gardner Scott channel and be sure to click on the bell so you're notified when a new video comes out, and you're also notified when the live stream happens on Mondays. I'm Gardner Scott. Enjoy gardening.